Jerusalem, September 20th, 1187. The inhabitants of Jerusalem looked outside the walls to see a large army approaching. The military force belonged to the formidable Muslim leader Saladin, who had conquered much of Egypt and Syria and now had his sights set on the Holy Land. For 12 days, Saladin and his forces attacked Jerusalem's walls. Cut off from outside help and facing the constant onslaught, the Christian army grew weaker and weaker. When it was clear that the city would be lost to Saladin and Muslim control, Balin of Ibelin, the leader of the Christian forces, threatened to burn all the Muslim holy sites and kill the 5,000 Muslim slaves. Saladin, who wanted to shed as little blood as possible, proposed a truce. He would let the Crusaders leave peacefully, provided they paid a tribute. On October 2nd, 1187, faced with no other choice, Balin surrendered Jerusalem to Saladin. Saladin, in turn, allowed Balin and the Christian army to leave peacefully. And if you've seen the 2005 movie The Kingdom of Heaven, you may be familiar with this story. Meanwhile, in Rome, an influential cleric by the name of Lotario de Conti de Signy was rising in the ranks of the Vatican. He couldn't help but see the siege and loss of the city of Jerusalem to Saladin and the Muslim forces as a type of divine retribution for the moral lapses of some of Europe's princes. Lotario de Conti de Signy would be made a cardinal priest, and then on January 8th, 1198, after only 2 ballots, he was elected pope, taking on the name Innocent III. Pope Innocent III would become one of the most important popes in history, instituting a variety of reforms and eventually convening one of the most influential councils in church history, the Fourth Lateran Council. Hi, this is Justin Hibbard, and you're listening to Why Catholic, my podcast about the what and why of Catholicism. Thank you so much for joining me today as we talk about one of the most important church councils, certainly the most important of the medieval ages. Before we do, however, let me just take a brief second to ask for your help. This podcast is my labor of love. It's a calling and a mission, but it also takes a lot of time and resources. If you would be so kind as to consider becoming a patron, it would mean just the world to me. I've made this super easy to do. Just go to whycatholic.substack.com/subscribe, and you can set up a monthly, annual, or a one-time gift. You may think, how can my $5 a month really make a big difference? But believe me, it does. Thank you for your consideration and support. We are in the middle of our series on the 21 Ecumenical Church Councils, and today we're going to be talking about the 12th Council, the Fourth Lateran Council. Interesting enough, at the time of this recording, we just celebrated a feast of the dedication of the Lateran Basilica, and it happened to occur on a Sunday. Most people think of St. Peter's Basilica as the mother church of the Catholic faith. In reality, St. Peter's is a basilica, which means it's given a special designation for its importance and beauty. However, it is not a cathedral. A cathedral is a church that has the bishop's chair. It is to say, it is the mother church of a diocese. And that distinction belongs to the Lateran Basilica, also known as St. John Lateran. This is the Bishop of Rome's, aka the Pope's, cathedral, and by extension, it's the mother church of all Catholics. This is why we have a special feast day set aside to celebrate it. This will be the last of a series of 4 councils to occur at the Lateran Basilica. After this, the next 5 councils will occur outside of Italy before returning to the Lateran Basilica one final time. The first 2 of the Lateran councils were rather minor and insignificant. The third one was definitely more important and impactful, but the Fourth Lateran Council, the council we'll discuss today, this council represented the pinnacle of the Catholic Church in the medieval ages. Whereas in this series, we've seen a couple of councils meet in a short time, as well as a century or 2 between ecumenical councils, this Fourth Lateran Council marked the 4th council in less than 100 years. I want to give a very brief overview of the context of this council and spend the majority of time focusing on the council itself. And to do that, we really need to focus on Pope Innocent III. Perhaps Pope Innocent III's most notable achievement as pope was expanding the influence of the papacy and directly impacting secular rulers. There was no country in Europe where the Pope didn't exercise some authority in temporal matters. For example, he excommunicated King Alfonso IX of Leon for violating church law by marrying a near relative, Bernharia of Castile. He weighed in on political disputes and helped form alliances that protected what would become the Papal States, and at the request of King John of England, Pope Innocent III invalidated the Magna Carta. The other aspect of Pope Innocent III's legacy had to do with the Crusades. The loss of Jerusalem in 1187 to Saladin and the Muslims was a wake-up call to Christians. Whatever good might be happening in Europe, the Christians had failed to work together to protect its most important pilgrimage site, the Holy Land. Instead of relying on secular leaders to organize a crusade, Pope Innocent III took leadership of taking back the Holy Land. To accomplish this, Pope Innocent sent envoys to various Catholic nations in order to gain support. He got warring nations like England and France to enter into truces and instead focus on fighting their common Muslim enemy. He raised funds for the crusade by requiring a 1/40th tax from all clergy, and in 1202, under the direction of Pope Innocent III, the Fourth Crusade began its assault on the growing Muslim powers. However, the crusade was derailed by political influences, where government leaders who had given money to the cause used the crusaders for their own purposes. Most notably, the Fourth Crusade resulted in Latin crusaders sacking Constantinople. This was not Pope Innocent III's doing. In fact, he threatened to excommunicate crusaders who attacked the capital of Eastern Christianity. And despite Pope Innocent's objection to the sack of Constantinople, this act solidified the schism between the West and the East. And in the end, the Fourth Crusade failed to accomplish the reconquest of the Holy Land. But Pope Innocent III didn't give up on his dream. After the failure of the Fourth Crusade, he had his sights on attempting a new one, and it's believed that this was a motivating factor in convening the Fourth Lateran Council on November 15th, 1215. The Fourth Lateran Council is sometimes referred to as the Great Lateran Council, and it's considered by some as in the top 4 or 5 most influential councils. In attendance were over 400 bishops, including 71 cardinals and archbishops. There were over 800 abbots from over 80 ecclesiastical provinces. It was also attended by St. Francis, who started the Franciscan order, and St. Dominic, founder of the Dominicans. There were also 23 Latin-speaking representatives from the Eastern Orthodox Church and a number of monarchs who also sent representatives to this council. It was the largest ecumenical council to occur between the Council of Chalcedon in 451 and the Second Vatican Council in the 1960s. Like some of the earlier councils, the Fourth Lateran Council would adopt both a statement of faith as well as administrative canons. However, unlike previous councils, which generally issued 20 or so canons, this council issued 71. And these canons aren't just a sentence or two, they are quite lengthy. I recommend checking out the Papal Encyclicals online link in the show notes if you'd like to read the canons in their entirety. Because I try to keep these episodes to under 20 minutes, I don't have time to summarize all 71 canons, so let me just give you a brief overview. The first canon is a statement of faith, and this is where I want to spend the majority of our time. Let me read a few portions of it and draw your attention to some distinctions. Quote, "We firmly believe and simply confess that there is only one true God, eternal and immeasurable, almighty, unchangeable, incomprehensible, ineffable. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, 3 persons, but one absolutely simple essence, substance, or nature. The Father is from none, the Son from the Father alone, and the Holy Spirit from both equally, eternally without beginning or end. The Father generating, the Son being born, and the Holy Spirit proceeding, consubstantial and co-equal, co-omnipotent and co-eternal." End quote. As we talked about in episodes 154, 158, and 159, one of the distinctions between the Western and Eastern churches was on the filioque clause. The Western church had added that the Holy Spirit proceeded from both the Father and the Son into the Nicene Constantinopolitan Creed. And here we see the council dogmatically declaring that the Holy Spirit indeed proceeds from the Father and the Son. The statement of faith goes on to say, quote, "The only begotten Son of God, Jesus Christ, who became incarnate by the action of the whole Trinity in common and was conceived from the ever-Virgin Mary through the cooperation of the Holy Spirit, having become true man, composed of a rational soul and human flesh, one person in 2 natures, showed more clearly the way of life. Although he is immortal and unable to suffer according to his divinity, he was made capable of suffering and dying according to his humanity." End quote. If you recall from the Church's Third Council, the Council of Ephesus, to the Church's Sixth Council, the Third Council of Constantinople, the major debate in the Church was over the nature of Jesus. Was he divine and human, and did he have one nature or 2? This statement of faith reiterates previous councils in saying that he was truly man and that he had a rational soul and human flesh. But unlike us mortals, he had 2 natures. He was also fully divine. The last part of the statement of faith pertains to the church and the sacraments. Quote, "There is indeed one universal church of the faithful, outside of which nobody at all is saved, in which Jesus Christ is both priest and sacrifice. His body and blood are truly contained in the sacrament of the altar under the forms of bread and wine, the bread and wine having been changed in substance by God's power into his body and blood, so that in order to achieve this mystery of unity, we receive from God what he received from us. Nobody can effect the sacrament except a priest who has been properly ordained according to the church's keys, which Jesus Christ himself gave to the apostles and their successors. But the sacrament of baptism is consecrated in water at the invocation of the undivided Trinity, namely Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and brings salvation to both children and adults when it is correctly carried out by anyone in the form laid down by the church." End quote. So here we see a number of doctrinal points of view. There is only one universal, the word for universal is Catholic, church, and there is no salvation outside the church. And if you want to hear more about that statement, take a listen to episode 58 called No Salvation Outside the Church. The statement of faith also dogmatically declares the real presence of Jesus in the Eucharist and uses the term transubstantiation. And during this time, there was a growing movement to reject clergy as unnecessary, and the statement of faith makes it clear that the consecration that occurs during communion can only be done by a priest who has been properly ordained in the apostolic succession. The statement of faith also lays out the sacrament of baptism, but notes that children and adults alike can be baptized by anyone provided they follow the proper formula, water, and the invocation of the Trinity. The second, third, and fourth canons deal with heretics. One of the large heretical groups at this time were the Albigensians of southern France, who promoted a type of Gnosticism, a rejection of the physical world. This is something I talked about in episode 156 on the Second Council of Nicaea. Of particular note in this section is the fourth canon, which focuses on the Greek Church and notes a deep desire for unification between the East and the West, but condemns those Greeks who were rebaptizing the Latins. Canons 5 through 13 deal with church polity, that is to say, church structure. In this series, we talked extensively about the 5 major C's of the church. This canon reestablishes that hierarchical order: Rome, Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch, and lastly, Jerusalem. Canon 9 recognizes that there are churches in the same diocese that have different rites and languages, and encourages the bishop of that diocese to appoint priests who can celebrate their liturgy appropriately in those different rites and languages. Canon 13 prohibits the establishment of new religious orders, and what's particularly interesting here is that a few years prior to this council, St. Francis of Assisi requested permission of Pope Innocent III to establish the Franciscan order, and it was ultimately approved in April of 1210. Canons 14 through 22 focus on clerical moral reforms. For example, the emphasis on chastity, prohibitions against gluttony and drunkenness, exhortations to live modestly and not be seen drinking at taverns, and priests are prohibited from prescribing a punishment that involves the shedding of blood. Canon 19 prohibits clerics from storing people's property at churches. The 20th canon requires that the Eucharist and chrism oil be stored under lock and key, and the 21st canon requires the faithful to go to confession at least once per year and exhorts the priest to maintain the confidence of the confessing. Any priest who breaks the seal of confession will be deposed of his position and sent to live in a monastery as perpetual penance. And Canon 22 exhorts doctors to advise their patients to call for a priest. Canons 23 through 32 deal with how bishops elect priests. It includes details like ensuring churches aren't without a prelate for more than 3 months, invalid elections due to clerics being appointed by secular leaders, carefully screening prelates, properly training priests, and ensuring that priests are paid an adequate income. Canons 33 and 34 deal with payments for visiting prelates. That is to say, bishops or priests that say Mass as a visitor to a parish should be given a nominal amount so as to cover their expenses, but under no circumstances should prelates be looking to make a profit from their clerical work. Canons 35 through 49 address matters related to canon law. Canon law is the legal system of the Catholic Church, and so these canons deal with matters such as maintaining records of legal trials, what happens when someone knowingly receives stolen goods, clerics and laity not usurping each other's rights, properly disposing of church property, etc. Canons 50 through 52 focus on matrimony. Canon 50 prohibits first cousins from marrying. Canon 51 prohibits secret marriages, which would nullify Romeo and Juliet's marriage. And Canon 52 prohibits hearsay when it comes to the determination of a legal marriage. Canons 53 through 61 pertain to tithing. Tithing is giving a tenth to the church as an offering. For example, Canon 55 says that the faithful ought to pay a tithe on their income before taxes are taken out. In other words, the tithe should be on the gross amount one makes and not on their net amount. These canons also address areas under interdiction, which means areas where the sacraments are prohibited due to some sort of punishment. The 62nd canon focuses on proper treatment of saints' relics. Specifically, it prohibits displaying relics outside of a reliquary or putting relics up for sale. Canons 63 through 66 address simony. As you recall from previous episodes, the buying and selling of church offices was a long-standing problem in the church, and just about every council prohibited it in their canons. This Fourth Lateran Council also addressed simony and gets very specific in how it defines it. Canon 67 through 70 pertain to the Jewish people. Canon 67 prohibits Jews from practicing usury against Christians, meaning that they are to be cut off from society if they charge excessive interest to Christians. Canon 68 requires Jews to dress differently from Christians so as to be identified in society. And here's where you can really start to see some of the social norms that will be used for rampant persecution later in history. Canon 69 prohibits Jews from holding public office. Canon 70 prohibits Jews from retaining their Jewish customs if they convert to Christianity. And finally, Canon 71, the longest canon, outlines a plan for a fifth crusade to take back the Holy Land. Unlike his predecessors that took a more passive role in the Crusades, Pope Innocent III saw his role as a necessary champion for the cause. The Fifth Crusade was set to begin in 1217. However, Pope Innocent III died suddenly in 1216, and the Fifth Crusade lost its biggest champion. Even without Pope Innocent III, the crusade commenced in 1217 and lasted for 4 years, and ultimately the Crusaders failed to recapture the Holy Land. The Fourth Lateran Council proved to be the most influential council in the Middle Ages, and it had a long-lasting effect on ecclesiastical and governmental laws for centuries afterwards. In fact, in the U.S. House of Representatives, you'll find marble relief portraits of 23 historical figures in honor of their influence on the development of American law. Pope Innocent III's portrait is one of those 23. I want to end this episode by taking a step back and looking at this council and time period from a 30,000-foot view, so to speak. If there's anything these councils have taught me, it's that the Catholic Church is often wrestling with its eternal place in an ever-changing, temporally hyper-focused society. For the first 300 years, Christianity was a religion without any political influence. In fact, it was oppressed politically. Then with emperors like Constantine and Theodosius, Christianity and the Roman Empire became nearly synonymous. If you were inside the empire, you were inside the church, and vice versa. The structure of the church became influential in the structure and development of secular society. There was the Christian empire, and everything outside were social and theological barbarians. As Europe became more fractured and developed into various structured nations, no longer was there just one church and one empire. The one church found itself within the borders of warring nations. The Byzantine emperor wanted the Pope's allegiance, and the king of the Franks wanted the Pope's blessing. As temporal kingdoms shrunk to manageable borders, Catholicism had found itself extending into all sorts of kingdoms, to the point where Catholics of one nation were fighting against Catholics of another nation. And here the Catholic Church needed to pivot again, this time becoming more like a lobbying force in the king's courts. It was no longer one side of the chessboard. It was the advisor telling one chess player how to move his pieces while advising the other how to move his. The Catholic Church was wrestling with the question of what is the role of the church with respect to the state. I think given that the temporal government, that is the state, is constantly evolving, the Catholic Church is always re-examining that question and redefining its place. And perhaps that is why the Fourth Lateran Council was so important and influential. It brought clarity where there had been confusion. It drew a line in the sand, so to speak, and this council's decisions would be influential as the church went head-to-head with certain global leaders and would once again call on the bishops to gather at subsequent councils to help amplify its voice in an ever-changing world. Thank you for joining me for Why Catholic. Be sure to subscribe to Why Catholic wherever you get your podcasts. And you can also subscribe to my Substack site and get the next episode in your email inbox. As a subscriber, you get a special discount code to the Why Catholic Etsy store. If you've been blessed by this podcast and you're feeling generous, there's also a way to financially support it, and patrons get some extra perks. To become a free subscriber or a patron, just go to whycatholic.substack.com/subscribe. Also join me on Instagram at whycatholicpodcast, all one word. Thanks again for listening. My name is Justin Hibbard, and this is Why Catholic. God bless you.